Thank you for joining us once again for the Bible, the church, and politics. So, this is our fifth week, um, and today we're talking about idols, ideologies, and institutions. Last week we were talking about biblical principles for our politics, and I think one of the most encouraging things that I've heard other people repeat was Walter talking to us about how many Christians on the left and the right, evangelicals and Catholics, actually share the same kind of basic eight principles and values. But what is different is actually that they prioritize them or rank them in terms of what they're voting on. So I think that's been a really great takeaway for me and for others. But today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about idols, ideologies, and institutions. Now, I've asked Robert Cunningham to join us. Many of you know Robert as the RUF campus minister at University of Virginia. And I've asked Robert to join me, not only because he's a good friend and because I really enjoy him as a conversation partner, also because Robert has just begun doctoral studies in political theology part-time at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And so Robert has been thinking about political theology for a while, and so he's been a very helpful dialogue partner for me um, as I've been thinking about these things. So before we begin, yeah, I guess at the beginning, before we begin, let me pray for us, and then we'll jump into what are idols. Father in heaven, it is so wonderful to be together, Lord. Thank you for the technology that we can be together, Lord, in some form, virtually. And we ask, oh Lord, that the words of our mouth and the meditations of our hearts, Lord, would be pleasing to you, Lord, especially as we think about these things that rival you, Lord, these things that are gods but are not gods. Thank you that you are the one God, O Lord, and that you reign supreme. And so we worship you and praise you, even as we begin this conversation. Would you be with us? In Christ's name, amen. So, we're talking about idols, ideologies, and institutions. So, Robert, when you hear a kind of a political idol or idolatry in terms of politics, how do you begin to think about that? Would you help us with that?
Yeah. Thanks again for letting me be part of this and just enjoying the conversational component here. I enjoy learning with you and am glad to share this with you. When I think about politics and idolatry or political idolatry, I want to name at the very beginning because politics speaks to things like identity and citizenship and belonging and has to do with loyalties that are ultimate oftentimes. I don't know that there's any realm of our lives that is perhaps more prone to idolatry than politics because of those things and the felt needs that those tap into.
Yeah.
But when we kind of go back to the scriptures and begin to try to understand, how does the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, depict idolatry, you'll find a wealth of resources. And the Bible really talks about idolatry in a number of ways. False gods, is another way to talk about idolatry. But usually, three categories or three things I'm going to name. Jesse's going to also give some categories that I think will help us kind of discern and depict how these might play out in our lives and our society. But when you're looking at the scriptures, you often see that idols are either objects within the visible creation. There's often these temptations to worship, uh, you know, things in the heavenlies, the sun, etc. That pervades a lot of the Old Testament. That's a lot of the temptation going on there, and that still exists today. There's often idols that have to do with the non-physical created order, meaning spiritual gods that are demonic. And then there's also idolatry as the product of human hands, things that we ourselves actually make and create individually or collectively that take on an ultimate kind of status in our lives. And one thing I want to name as well is that the spiritual component of this conversation is very mysterious. And in many ways, it can be, these can kind of permeate one another, where perhaps something that is the work of our hands might take on a life of its own in the spiritual realm that becomes a principality and power that has
Mm.
a deep and demonic influence over us or over a whole society over time. So those are a few of the categories that you see very kind of quickly and clearly at the beginnings of the scriptures. And what else would you kind of add to that, Jesse?
Yeah, I love. Um, there's a reformed political scientist, Coises, and he talks about that idolatry is taking something out of creation's totality and raising it above that creation and making the latter revolve around it and serve it. So I think I really appreciate you giving us a little bit more diverse manifestations of those idols. They do involve principalities. There is even a devil, a personal devil behind those,
Mhm.
and yeah, I think that category is really helpful. One of the things that I think about for political idolatry, as I begin to think about the Old Testament, I think about how closely idols and politics went together. Uh,
Mm,
I've an example of this in 1 Kings 12. Um, so this is right when Israel splits. The kingdom is split. Solomon's son and Jeroboam leads a rebellion against Rehoboam, which is
mm,
Solomon's. And one of the first things he does, he's in Israel, is he makes idols. And so this is 1 Kings 12:28. So the king took counsel and made two calves of gold. And he said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold, your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not the Levites. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast was in Judah, and he offered sacrifice on the altar. Anyway, all this to say, what I think is so interesting is we have kind of a connection between the idol and the ideologies and the institutions. We have all three in this passage. We have the institutions of a new temple. We have a priesthood. All of this like a separate rival priesthood. And we also have this ideology. Behold, your gods, right? This is what saved you. And so I just find that really interesting that idols in the Old Testament are so tied into politics.
mm.
In the
Yeah,
Bible.
and I'll tag onto that. One book that I'll go ahead and recommend at the outset is a book called Here Are Your Gods. It's a new book that just came out by a missiologist named Christopher Wright. He works for Langham Partnership, kind of in the lineage of John Stott, but a brilliant Old Testament scholar and ethicist and missiologist. And one of the things that he notes, kind of on your same point, Jesse, is in Exodus 32, verse 4, and in Second or First Kings 12:28, the phrase, behold your gods, is also followed by who brought you up, out of Egypt.
Hmm.
And there's this fascinating reality of immediately the idolatry is kind of embedded in a narrative
Yeah,
that it's redemptive and salvific and worthy of like your ultimate hopes and loyalty and allegiance. And it can be very totalizing in the ways that you said, ideologies and institutions, etc.
yeah, yeah. That's so. As we think about what are some potential and you can use this from a variety of your observations, Robert, but when you begin to think about idols and ideologies and their connection and our kind of contemporary climate, like what do you think of? Like
Mm.
where do you see kind of where are the political idols in 21st century America?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think in naming these, I'll also name. I think what's so difficult about political idolatry is that we're all susceptible to being deceived into this kind of idolatry. So even as I try to name some, I know that some of them have like a bad foothold in my own life that I'm still trying to discern, and that's what discipleship is about. Um, but I guess at the basis, before I name specific ones, I think some helpful metrics to think like kind of conjures up or creates idolatry, and it's usually connected to things that like entice us, like splendor and majesty and power and greatness, things that we fear. Whether that's poverty or being in unjust situations or being attacked in some way, shape, or form, being vulnerable. It also pertains to things that we trust that might provide security. Things that we need, like provision, can be connected to idolatry. That's rampant in the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. And and all of those things are kind of always working on each other. But I think in our current moment, I know that this has shaped me. I think we have an idol of individualism that's kind of insane. We live in a very unique cultural moment in that regard,
Yep.
and that plays out like just that one could be kind of siphoned off, and you could look at the ways that plays out in our economic idolatries of consumerism, the way it plays out, and even like our sexual idolatries, and the ways
Yep.
that we are so unmoored and untethered to a lot of you know what has been historic kind of understandings of the self.
Yeah.
It's manifest, but I think individualism is one of the first things that comes to my mind. But then I think consumerism and the love of money. I think there's all kinds of kind of narcissistic, self-aggrandizing things that we're invited into through social media.
Mm.
Anyway, those are just a few off the top.
I so as we're talking about individualism, I think about when I think about the like what are the political implications for that?
Mhm.
I think almost immediately like Cain and Abel, and like am I my brother's keeper? And that's kind of the political like
Mm,
Americans often think of me myself first, and yet one of the things the Bible is constantly pushing us to, like the Good Samaritan, is that we're actually responsible for one another,
mm,
and which I just find that really intriguing. One of the things that I would love to make a point here about connecting idol to the idol of individualism, I think in many ways we could tie that to the institution of abortion,
mm,
which I think is there's a political like we live in a culture where this is my body and I get to do with it what I want. I mean, I think abortion is really complicated. It's a very complicated thing, and I don't think anyone wants abortion. But I do think that the institution of kind of widespread on-demand abortion does seem to be like an institutional manifestation of this kind of like idol of individualism, or like I can do it. I belong to myself alone.
mhm,
And so I just think that's a helpful illustration of kind of how is the idol and the ideology kind of connected to the institution.
mm,
Uh,
mhm.
yeah. Do you have any other like? Are there any other good examples of that kind of connecting institutions to?
Yeah, so I think consumerism and kind of materialism and greed is another one that I think touches all of our lives.
Yeah.
It can be connected to multiple institutions. I mean, if you want to, I mean, we could talk about the whole industry of kind of credit cards, and I think it's hilarious that there's something called the Chase Freedom Card. It's just this that absorbs us into, there's no need to delay gratification. Everything is available, increasingly like at the split-second click. And I think that's an institution it's just reinforcing the materialism and the consumerism that perhaps we've made ourselves. But I think it's very easy. To me, that's a very easy example of we constructed this thing and now we're enslaved to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a whole system that. Yeah. Yeah. Um, hmm. One other thing about as we've been talking about the Old Testament, which I love thinking about Old Testament. One other thing that I think about politics too is it's also connected to alliances. Like politics are about alliances, and one of the things that the Israelites are constantly being chastened for by God is don't make alliances. Like your salvation is not in other nations.
Right.
Your salvation is in the Lord. There's this great passage in Isaiah chapter 30 in which it says, this is Isaiah 30, verse 1, "Ah, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, and who make an alliance, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt.
Mm.
Therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn to your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation. So this kind of gets at the part of idol that you were talking about like what do you fear most? I mean, Israel is a small country in the middle of like the Assyrian Empire and the Egyptian Empire, and so like it actually makes a lot of political sense that they would ally with each other. Like they're afraid, and yet the Lord chastens them for that. Um, I think yeah, alliances. And politics really is all about alliances, which I
Right,
especially like, and that's really what I think even an election is about. Who are you going to ally yourself to?
right.
Um, you've done a lot though about how Christians need to be like very complicated in
Yeah,
their alliances. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about
yeah,
that?
and I'll say it's interesting when you're looking at the Old Testament, you're seeing a lot of the nations had gods, right? And so to align yourself with Babylon or with Egypt or Assyria was to also kind of entrust yourself to their gods in this interesting way that was very particular to Israel's story, and it feels different for us in many ways, but some of that can still be going on. And a couple of things to know, throughout the scriptures we see again and again that idolatry is always destructive. It
Hmm.
actually harms you over time, and it oftentimes harms others. Idolatry is always connected in the scriptures to like radical acts of injustice and systems of oppression.
Yeah.
And then it also is disappointing, and that's one of the things God even includes in His injunctions to His people to not turn there for power, for security, for protection, because that will fade. It will fall to dust, and they will be left helpless, and someone else will come in. And so, anyway, that being the case, I do think when I think about our political moment, I do think a two-party system in the 21st century West in the United States of America is a really complicated thing that lends itself in many ways to idolatry because you can so easily invest wholeheartedly in one platform, and in doing so become someone. It's easy to be co-opted into thinking I will be like this political party will determine my beliefs
Yeah.
instead of my beliefs determining which party I might align with a little bit. And so I think one of my favorite verses when we're thinking about politics in the scriptures is in Joshua 5:13 when the Israelites are about to go into the land of Canaan, and the angel of the Lord meets the army there, and they say, "Are you for us or against us?" And the answer is no. And it's just such a powerful moment of the Lord reigns,
Hmm.
and the invitation throughout the scriptures and throughout history in different times and in different places in ways that look different in different times and different places is to surrender and submit to the lordship of Jesus, to
Yeah.
see Him as your king, and to not be co-opted into all these other different narratives that are competing for your loyalty. And so I do think one of the great challenges that I think we face right now in Christian witness is to be increasingly complicated people who live nuanced lives that have nuanced thoughts and opinions on different issues
Hmm.
that will not conscript easily into one party's narrative. And
Yeah.
uh, every force in the world is pushing against you being that kind of person.
Yeah.
Social media is trying to make you not that kind of person. All the kind of advertisements we get are trying to make you not that kind of person. And yet I think again, that's part of what it means to be a Christian right now is to be a complicated individual with regard to how you look at the political scene.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Are you for us or against us? And no.
No.
It feels like a very. I feel like Jesus was. That's kind of the subtext of like the
Yes.
Pharisees and like Jesus constantly saying, "No, my
Right.
question is different." Um, yeah, you're talking about this complicated. There's a story from Billy Graham's life. Billy Graham had good relationships with American presidents, and he really got close to Richard Nixon. I mean, Nixon was a churchgoer, and so Graham really got behind Nixon. And after Watergate, though, I mean, Graham was just so disappointed and kind of chastened. Like he had kind of put put all his eggs in this kind of basket of this politician, and so Graham made a course correction there in his political life, which I think is really instructive for us. It just doesn't look good when we kind of, yeah, I think we have to be very careful in the sort of alliances and the public witness that we make to that. Um, so as we're talking more about ideology and idolatry, I think some of this is like these are like deep presuppositions that we just like individualism.
Mhm.
They're so deep, and we just like it. They're often unreflected on,
Right.
um, but I but but they really do have a distorted view of the world. I think about we could have an I think I see people in 21st century America having a kind of faith in democracy, that democracy is kind of the preeminent form of government, and the there's this great quote: "All the ills of democracy can be cured by more democracy." There's this kind of like, if we could just make our system more democratic, um, and uh, and yet what's really at root when you think about the ideology of democracy is like the will of the people should reign, like
Mm.
the will of the people should reign, and that I just think as a Christian that's a really interesting.
That sounds a lot like Judges chapter 21. It can though.
Yeah, the eyes, they all did what was right in their own, and even from a historical, Mark Knoll is a great evangelical historian, and one of the points he makes in America's God is the fact that actually in the 18th century, in the Revolutionary period, American Revolutionary period, it was the unorthodox people, people who didn't have orthodox Christianity. I mean Jefferson, Thomas Paine, they
Yeah.
were like the preeminent Republicans and Democrats, because most Orthodox Christians in Europe were like, democracy, if we're Calvinists and we really believe that man is inherently evil, like why would we want the will of the people? I find that really interesting. This kind of like I don't know the American 21st century American Christians think about democracy in those
Right.
more complicated ways, or merging that with their faith. Um, yeah, but we could do that for any number of things. I mean, socialism kind of takes like one.
Mm.
Socialism says the evil is private ownership,
Mm.
uh, which is taking. I mean, it's taking one little thing about created good and saying that is evil, and then it's the flip point of that is that if we could just make common ownership, if everyone could own the means,
Right.
if everything was equal, that would actually fix the problem. But yeah, I think all these like they're missing something about the heart of man. That actually what is wrong with us is not can't be governed out of us.
Mhm.
But there's actually kind of a defect in us, in ourselves. Yeah, and I mean that's true of nationalism as well.
Right.
Nationalism, any of the isms,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we've talked about. Um, but how would you, Robert, as you've been thinking about like how to counsel your students in faithfulness, political faithfulness, like how do you begin to think about encouraging them not to go towards idolatry or to be this kind
Right.
of politically complicated?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons I love getting to work with university students is because you often can see certain trends or you see certain things that are happening uh, before they maybe become even more mainstream. And there is a sense in which I with Christian students that I meet with regularly, I think a few things that I've noticed is there is a deep burning for a comprehensive ethic
Hmm.
in the political realm. And I think one of the greatest tragedies that many have experienced in different Christian communities has been a political idolatry that led to a very selective ethic.
Hmm.
Meaning, because we're a mostly this, political spectrum leaning church, we care about these
Yep.
ethical issues.
Hmm.
And over time, that I suppose, that witnesses against you if that's the kind of community you've been. And I think that's something that a lot of the students that I'm around crave is like, okay, how do I find this? And I see it can be very, it's easy to be reactionary, or I notice that it is, to be like, well, then maybe it means bouncing all the way over here. And I think a lot of it is learning, okay, that's not the way. The way is not just reactionary and go wholesale the opposite side that
Yeah.
you've been frustrated with.
Yeah.
um, but what does it mean to kind of walk this path again, where Jesus is the one who gets to determine what Christian values are, and not a political persuasion? uh,
Yeah.
and so I think that's still, but that, to be honest with you, has been the main thing that I've noticed over the past several months in the conversations I've had in
Yeah.
our political climate.
Yeah. You've been talking about this. You have this language of like a third way.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's certainly not like new to me, but I do think that's helpful. And I think what's hard though is it doesn't mean that here's someone on the far right, here's someone on the far left, and you're just supposed to be like a centrist on everything.
mhm.
I think part of what a third way really means is to be so tethered to Jesus,
Yeah.
where like his way is the way, and that may make you look really conservative on some issues, that may make you look really liberal on some issues, in terms of our political parlance, but it is his way. And I think that's way easier said than done, but I do think there is this deep invitation, again and again, to live a life of repentance, individually and corporately, as a body, as a local body of believers, and to kind of always be engaged in this work of like, what does it mean for us to actually believe that Jesus is the King?
Mhm.
And how should that shape the way we think? How should it shape the way we use our money, or think about our vocations, treat one another and look at those we disagree with, all those things. But
Yeah.
that has been very compelling to me.
Yeah. We um, so we began this whole class talking about Christian freedom, that politics is in this realm of sort of liberty of conscience and Christian freedom,
Mm.
which I wonder if, I mean, yeah, it is so, what's so difficult is the fact that Jesus is king. Like,
Right.
what are those implications in 21st century America where it feels like we're in a post Christian, uh, many think that we're in a post Christian society. That said, I mean, we have Donald Trump and Mike Pence, who are very explicitly courting the evangelical vote. I mean, Mike Pence is an evangelical. So I like, how do we? I guess the question I have for you is, it's just a really complicated mess. Like, how do we have Christians that are coming down on so many different sides about what to do in
Right.
an election. Um, yeah, how do we begin to tease that out? Like, what are the
Yeah.
implications that Jesus is king?
I think at one level, and we've talked about this some before, I think one of the initial invitations for all of us, and for anyone who's a professing Christian, is to make uh, our current partisan political moment not ultimate.
Hmm. Yeah.
And again, I think the narrative on both sides is an ultimate narrative.
Yeah.
This is it. Either this happens and everything falls apart, either this happens and everything falls apart.
Yeah.
And both of those are false. And what I mean by that is, one of the ways I think about this is, if you read the Bible, in many ways, the scriptures contain the story of just collapsing empires left and right. It's Egypt, it's Assyria, it's Babylon, it's Persia, it's Greece, it's Rome,
Yeah.
and they all end up in dust,
Hmm.
no matter how great they were. And all empires come to an end
Yeah.
under the sovereign hand of God, and that is why Jesus is king, and that is why no country, no political party, no human leader is worthy of your ultimate allegiance, nor could they ever bear the weight of it. And so there's a very real sense where that's not meant to frighten us,
Yeah.
but it's actually meant to assure us that to belong to Jesus and to live a life that witnesses to his reign is the most secure and lasting eternal place you could be. And uh, again, that has to be nurtured over the course of our lives,
Hmm.
because I notice this a lot. Is you'll kind of say, hey, it doesn't need to be ultimate. Like this election is not ultimate,
Yeah.
and on both sides, people will be like, yeah, but like, and they'll kind of throw in the caveat,
Yeah.
and And to each of those, I would say, no, 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 it truly cannot be.
Hmm.
And, even if, according to your narrative, you know, your party loses and whatever the worst thing you could imagine were to happen, Jesus still reigns.
Mm-hmm.
And he still invites you to live a life that bears witness to his reign, even if it means loving sacrificially your enemies.
Yeah.
And again, so a lot of this also, I was going to say this earlier, Jesse, is that I think so much of this goes back to the third way is also the way of the cross.
Hmm.
And there's a very real sense in which that is so liberating.
Yeah.
And it can free you, again, to hold everything in the penultimate state that it really is,
Yeah.
and still use your civic agency and try to think about the common good and try to think about what it means to love your neighbor with your vote, etc.
Yeah.
But you do it from a place where you know that Christ is king.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this great part in 1 Corinthians 7 in which Paul is talking about because the world is passing away, and so he says like,
Mhm.
let those who are doing business do business as if they're not doing business. And so I just love like I just want to add voting into that. Like, let those who vote vote as if their voting didn't matter.
Mm.
The present form of this world is passing away. I think I think that's a really refreshing. That's just very refreshing. Of like, this is not eternal stakes. There are eternal stakes in some things, and I think as Christians, like,
Right.
to realize what is and where to trust the Lord in that, I think that is the exercise of wisdom that
And
you're
I will say, like, it's easy. So much of this is living in a deep tension. To say that this is not ultimate doesn't mean that it's not worth, giving so much of yourself
yeah
uh, toward the good of your neighbor,
yeah
toward justice, toward a culture of life and truth and beauty and goodness. And and so you're definitely mishearing it if you're like, oh, Jesus reigns, therefore nothing matters. That's definitely not the case.
yeah yeah. Well, Robert, thank you so much. This has been really great. Wayne, I would love to give you guys the small groups. I'm going to put them up on the screen here and kind of walk through the small group questions. Um, One of the things that, since we're talking about idolatry, we're going to look at that's going to be the nature of the small group questions. So, what was most helpful about thinking about politics in terms of idols and ideologies? Why? We didn't get into all the different idols. Charlie Drew actually started us on this um, at the very beginning, and he brought up at least three idols of like statism, which he defined by um, looking to the state or policy or programs to kind of solve everything. Um, there's also the idol of privacy, right? That I'm just going to worry about myself. I think privacy is kind of related to individualism there. Privacy, I'm just going to worry about myself. I don't need to think about my neighbor. And I think those are actually really interesting, intriguing um, idols that kind of critique maybe privacy libertarians, and then I think statism kind of more socialistic, progressive. But anyway, just thinking about what is helpful about thinking about politics in terms of idols and ideologies. And then how can political alliances point out idols? When can they be helpful? Alliances, that is. Um, and then here's where we're going to get a little bit more personal. We're going to kind of touch some sore spots here. What are you most afraid of in this election? And how might that point to a susceptibility to an idol? I think that our emotions are very clear indicators of idolatry. When we're very afraid or very desirous. And then I would love for you to spend a good chunk praying for the election, praying for the candidates, especially those who are local. Um, Pray for the voters. Pray for those who will not be voting. Pray for righteousness and justice. Pray that Christians will act in a way that honors Christ. So I just want to invite us to end in prayer. That said, next week it will be our last class, and we're going to spend the majority of that class actually in prayer. Um, Lord willing, we will know the results of the elections. Lord willing, maybe we won't. Either way, we can pray. Either way, we can pray. And so that will be next Wednesday. We'll end this class in prayer. So let me pray for us, and then we will go out into our small groups.